that you're used to. Verse 11, and he says, and this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon. How long? 70 years. For 70 years. And we're going to talk about that later, pick up on that again about the 70 years situation, about the 70-year captivity. But he's already telling them. And part of this, I'm going to summarize a lot here, but Jeremiah had the opportunity to buy some land from one of his relatives. And that's the only way he can buy land was given because a relative offered him land in his own city, town, which is not too far from Jerusalem. And he bought the land. And he made a deed of it because he knew that eventually they were coming back. Now, he may not physically come back. He didn't know that. But he said, you need to just go ahead and accept this thing as an illustration to them. We're going to come back someday, but it's going to be 70 years when we come back. Be able to come back to this land. So moving on. 2 Kings chapter 24. Move this out of my way. 2 Kings chapter 24, if you would, please. Move this over. Second Kings chapter 24. It says, in his days, in the days of King Jehoiakim, it says, in his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant 3 years. Jehoiakim is what? He is the king of the southern kingdom. Been on the horizon, knowing they're going to come, knowing the Babylonians are going to come. The Babylonian king came, and now he is the servant to the Babylonian king. He is a vassal. He has to pay a tribute to Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? He has to pay a tribute to him. Well, then it says the next part of that verse. We'll flip over here to the next part of this. And I took the same quote, same verse, but the rest of it says, after 3 years, really, it says what? Then he turned and rebelled against him. He rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. After 3 years, he rebelled against him. Okay, so what happens here when he rebels against him, as you see here, let's go down and follow out in chapter 2 Kings here. And the Lord sent against him hands of the Chaldees, and hands of the Syrians, and hands of the Moabites, and bands, I said hands, but I mean bands of the Chaldees, bands of the Syrians, and bands of the Moabites, and bands of the children of Ammon, and sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord, which he spake by his servants, the prophets. Who are the Chaldeans? Who? The Babylonians. Yes, the Babylonians are also known as the Babylonians, also known as the Chaldeans. Okay, that's who came. And he's talking about all these others, all these other nations around them are come to fight against Judah. Of course, we know about the Syrians, the Moabites, the Ammonites, all of them. He says, and they came against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord, which he spake by his servants, the prophets. Surely at the commandment of the Lord came this upon Judah to remove them out of his sight for the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he did. Now, who is Manasseh? And he was a king, right? He was a king, a bad king, and ruled for like 52 years, if I'm not mistaken. And it says here, also the innocent blood, and also for the innocent blood that he shed, for he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, which the Lord would not pardon. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And Jehoiakim slept with his fathers, and Jehoiachin his son reigned in his stead. He rebelled, and he suffered for it. That's not just him suffering, but the people suffered for it. The whole nation. But because they did what? The whole nation were, he was evil. He was an evil king himself. His brothers were evil. His uncle was evil, Zedekiah. They were all evil. They all did evil in the sight of the Lord. And by their sins, and not just their sins as kings, but their sins as a people with their idolatry, thinking they're okay, they sinned. And God says here, what it says in this verse, because in verse 4, and also for the innocent blood which he shed, for he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, which the Lord would not pardon. Because of their sins. Because of their sins, they were being judged by the Babylonians finally. You think about that in perspective again. The Assyrians had already taken the northern kingdom, which is Israel. The southern kingdom said, hey, we're okay. God's with us. We're safe. But God says, you're not safe. You're not okay because of your sins, and you will not repent. You're going to have to suffer for it. So Daniel chapter 1, if you'll turn to Daniel chapter 1, you see that. Daniel chapter 1. And in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, into Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasurer's house of his God, talking about Nebuchadnezzar's God. They were carried to Babylon. And the king spake against Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes, and children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom and cunning and knowledge and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, whom that they might teach the learning in the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat, of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years. And at the end thereof, they might stand before the king. Now among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Ahazarah. And of course, we know, if you read the book of Daniel, we're very familiar with that later on. We're not going to deal with the book of Daniel. But this here is Daniel and the what? The other three guys, here's their Hebrew names. They were given Babylonian names that we're so familiar with. What are the Babylonian names? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We're so familiar with that. We just rolls off our tongue easier than their Hebrew names do. But what was taken was the Babylonians, they went and chose certain young guys to bring over to Babylon to teach them, to learn the ways of the Babylonians, to be of use to them. Okay? The Assyrians were a little bit differently. Assyrians didn't care. They wiped out everything. And they were ruthless in a lot of ways. Babylonians a little bit, don't get me wrong now, they were fighting people, don't get me wrong. But they did do certain things like this, taking young people from different places, transporting them to Babylon to teach them the Babylonian ways, to influence them in a way. Okay? So Daniel was part of this first deportation that you see here taking place. Okay, let's move on here. Here's a little diagram of that. I just brought this in to you to show the things we just talked about briefly, that those who were taken. Give you an idea, they were taken from Jerusalem to Babylon. Here's what the gates in Babylon for the empire there. Just give you an idea. That's almost a 1,500-mile trip. No wagons, like a wagon trail, like stagecoach trip, no the trains, no airplanes, no vehicles. You do it by foot the best you can. You think about that long trip to get there. The Babylonians came down, their soldiers, and they brought them back up there. Probably a lot of people just didn't make it along the way. The Babylonians really didn't care if you made it or didn't. They're just going to do the best to get you back up there, I guess. Okay, so the second deportation, it says Ezekiel, because Ezekiel will be the next key person that's taking the second one here. Ezekiel's the most illustrative of all the prophets, because if you ever read the book of Ezekiel, you see a lot of prophecies in there that are just a very elaborate light in a way, so many ways. But they are God's word. The prophecies are, okay? But the thing about Ezekiel, he preached to help the people understand. Jeremiah preached to let the people know, hey, judgment's coming. Ezekiel, when he was deported there in Babylon, he was trying to help them. Hey, we just got to live here. We got to deal with this. This is part of what we have to do. This is part of what we have to address living here because of God's judgment on us. I'm just giving you a quick here. In his period of Ezekiel, 10,000. If you turn to 2 Kings, let's see. 2 Kings chapter 24. Flip back over here. 2 Kings chapter 24. 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 13 and 16. Let's go to verse 10. Just pick up on verse 10. And at the time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against Jerusalem, and the city was besieged. And Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came against the city, and his servants did besiege it. And Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, went out to the king of Babylon, he and his mother and his servants and his princes and the officers, and the king of Babylon took them in the 8th year of his reign. And he carried out thence all the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold which Solomon, king of Israel, had made in the temple and of the Lord, as the Lord had said. And he carried away all Jerusalem, all the princes, all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and smiths. None remained, save the poorest of the people of the land. At that time, you might be your best to be one of the poorest people of the land because you're safer. He left those behind to take care of the land. But he took all what? He took the whole king, his family, all of them were deported, taken away. All of them were taken as prisoners, and all these others were taken as well. As you think about all these people that were taken as captives, and the craftsmen, the smiths, none remained, save the poorest of the people of the land. And he carried away Jehoiachin to Babylon, and the king's mother, and the king's wives, and his officers, and the mighty of the land, who carried he into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon. And all the men of might, even 7,000, and craftsmen and smiths 1,000. I'm in verse 16. All that were strong and apt for war, even them the king of Babylon brought captive to Babylon. And the king of Babylon made Mattaniah his father's brother king in his stead, and changed his name to Zedekiah. And you'll know, we'll refer to Zedekiah here in a moment. So taking him away. So this is the second deportation that takes place. It takes place about 597. As you see here, about 597 takes place. Okay? And that is quick for Ezekiel, or that second deportation. But they were taken into captivity. The interesting one, if we get to Zedekiah, the third deportation, what takes place here. Even though Nebuchadnezzar came on the second one and conquered here and took some of the vessels out of the house of the Lord, he's not finished because they would not behave themselves. The king of Judah, they would not behave themselves. He did what here? What you see here? Excuse me. Verse 17. And the king of Babylon made Mattaniah his father's brother king in his stead, and changed his name to Zedekiah. And Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. And he did that which was what? Evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that Jehoiakim had done. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. So move over here. So the next deportation. I meant to tell you this here about Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapter 1, this is when Ezekiel talks about him being in Babylon here. Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, he says, Now it came to pass in the 13th year, in the 4th month, and the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives by the river Chebar, that the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. And on the 5th day of the month, that was the 5th year of the king Jehoiakim's captivity, the word of the Lord came expressly unto Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of Chaldeans by the river Chebar, and the hand of the Lord was there upon him. This is just the opening of the book of Ezekiel as he presents it. And Ezekiel's pointing out, the reason for this is to point out, he's talking about being in the land of the Babylonians, the land of the Chaldeans, how the Lord spoke to him, and then you have the book of Ezekiel presented here. But I'll just give you a little part of that. But back to the third deportation here. Though Zedekiah, Jehoiakim's uncle and Joshua's son, was left as a puppet ruler of Judah, it is clear that the Jewish people regarded Jehoiachin as the true descendant of David, as the true king of David. At the time, and I'm going to shorten this up a little bit here. At the time, there was other prophets that were saying, oh no, Jehoiakim, he will be back. After 2 years, he will be coming back. He'll be coming back into place and be taking over again in 2 years. And Jeremiah is telling them that is not true. That is not true. That's not what's going to happen. There's still what? The 70 years has to be fulfilled. Jehoiakim is not coming back. But there's false people, false prophets going around saying, oh, no. And so they didn't like the king that was already appointed. Zedekiah was appointed as the king by Nebuchadnezzar, but they didn't like him. But they kept thinking, well, the other king will come back, and he is really the real king. Well, it didn't happen. As you see here, Jehoiakim, he never returned to Jerusalem, it is true, but after long years as a political prisoner in Babylon, he was placed on a government pension and apparently was treated more as the honored guest of the Babylonians in 2 Kings chapter 25. I just brought this thing here to show you the relationship. Joshua and his sons and Zedekiah is down here, okay? Just kind of give you a relationship of who these are. I know there's a lot of different names here for you. Zedekiah was, however, the king as de facto. Like I said, Nebuchadnezzar chose him as to be the king. The people didn't like him to be the king, but he is the king. They didn't like it. And they rebelled. They wind up rebelling against Nebuchadnezzar, and thus what happens? They rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar again. Nebuchadnezzar is not going to sit back and let you keep rebelling and getting by with it. So this time he comes down. Nebuchadnezzar comes this time. Let me go here. 2 Kings chapter 25. 2 Kings chapter 25. Get over here. And it came to pass. Excuse me. Let me get a drink. Oh, yeah. 2 Kings chapter 25 and verse 1. And it came to pass in the 9th year, the reign in the 10th month, in the 10th day of the month, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, he and all his host against Jerusalem and pitched against it, and they built forts against it round about. And the city was besieged unto the 11th year of King Zedekiah. And on the 9th day of the 4th month unto the famine prevailed in the city, and there was no bread for the people of the land. And the city was broken up, and all the men of the war fled by night by the way of the gate between two walls, which by the king's garden. Now the Chaldees were against the city round about. And the king went the way toward the plain. In other words, Zedekiah and some of his men thought they can escape because Jerusalem's surrounded by the Babylonians. They had an opening in the wall. They thought they'd escape and get away from this. Like a bunch of cowards, really. Leaving your city, leaving your people behind who are dealing with famine and what they've been going through, and then think they can run away from it. Of course, it didn't work. And the army of the Chaldees pursued, in verse 5, after the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho, and all his army were scattered from him. So they took the king and brought him up to the king of Babylon, to Riblah. Now, Nebuchadnezzar had an outpost, at this place here. He was set up here outside this place called Riblah. Okay? And they gave judgment upon him. And they slew the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Can you imagine that, having to see your sons killed right in front of you? But also the next thing that happened, they blinded Zedekiah. That was the last image he ever saw, was his sons being killed, and they blinded him for that. And bound him, it says, and put out his eyes of Zedekiah, and bound him with fetters of brass, and carried him to Babylon. And in the 5th month, on the 7th day of the month, which is the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, King Babylon, came Nebuzaradan. Now he's a captain, okay? He's a captain of the guard, a servant of the king of Babylon unto Jerusalem. And he burnt the house of the Lord and the king's houses, and all the houses of Jerusalem, and every great man's house burnt he with fire. And all the army of the Chaldeans that were with the captain of the guards brake down the walls of Jerusalem round about. Now the rest of the people that were left in the city, and the fugitives that fell away to the king of Babylon with the remnant of the multitude, did Nebuchadnezzar, the captain of the guard, carry away. But the captain of the guard left of the poor of the land to be vineyard dressers and husbandmen. And the pillars of the brass that were in the house of the Lord, and the bases and the brazen sea that was in the house of the Lord, did the Chaldeans break in pieces and carried the brass to Babylon. And the pots and the shovels and the snuffers and the spoons and all the vessels of the brass wherewith they ministered, they took they away. And the fire pans and the bowls and such things as were of gold and in gold and of silver and of silver in silver, captain of the guard took away. The 2 pillars of one sea and the bases which Solomon had made for the house of the Lord. The brass of all these vessels was without weight. The height of one pillar was 18 cubits, and he goes on and explains all that. Let me ask you this. This coming of this third deportation was more extensive of damage to take place. besides taking Zedekiah, besides killing his sons and taking him into captivity, destroying Babylon, destroying the temple that they said, hey, nobody can touch this. This is God's place. They destroyed the temple. They destroyed the walls of Jerusalem. They took everything they could. Everything of any worth they took from them. The silver, the brass, the gold, whatever they had, all the vessels that were used in the temple, anything they had, they took away from them and left the poorest of the poor in the land. This is pretty devastating for Judah here. Because Nebuchadnezzar was kind of fed up with them rebelling. They've already rebelled twice already. This is the third time to quench all that. But it was God's plan. And this kind of gives you the thing we just addressed here about all those that were taken in this time. The walls, I got here, the walls of Jerusalem were broken down, the brass, the gold, all that was taken, of course, we just talked about, and the temple was destroyed at this time. Pretty devastating to them. So moving on to the conclusion here. I took all three of those together. This is all three of them here together for you to see it in one group here. These as it progressed along. But the 70-year captivity, I got it at the bottom there, I kept it on the bottom there for you, because this is not 70 years, of course. It's just the beginning of the 70 years, which continues on, of course, that you'll see here. Jeremiah the prophet predicted a 70-year period of captivity of Babylon. We already talked about that. We read that passage earlier for you. If you want to turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 36. I should have been there already, but 2 Chronicles chapter 36. Go over here, because I was talking about Zedekiah for you. 2 Chronicles chapter 36. Move this over. This author says there were like two captivities in a way. Political and religious, because of political was the country, the people were taken into captivity. The religious was that with the destruction of the temple. Now we'll show this, illustrate this. I got an illustration here if you see this here about the 3 deportations taking place and the 70-year period. But also what was taking place when the temple was destroyed at the 3rd deportation, there's 70 years before it's rebuilt again. So that's just something to keep in perspective there. Jeremiah had been preaching to them, there's going to be 70 years of captivity. It's just going to be that way, what God had promised to be done. Part of that, if you think about it, is from Leviticus. In Leviticus chapter 24, that's what's on there for you. I'll have all that here for you, but we can look at that part. But Leviticus chapter 24, the page just turned around. Is about the time of this. If you see here, where's it? Turn on the next page over. It has been observed that Israel and Judah had forsaken the command of God to give 1 year in service to God by allowing the land to rest from agricultural use. They would use it, and then they would, on the 7th year was to be a year of rest. And that's addressed in the book of Leviticus, chapter 24. Can you imagine that? Farm the land, do all you can, but the 7th year, you don't do anything to it. Well, they didn't stop. They said, no, we're not going to do that. But God promised if you do that, He would bless you. And they didn't do it. He promised them that in the 6th year, you would have enough to cover the 7th year and the next year as well. He would bless you. The people didn't do that. They said, no, we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. And they did that. And thinking them as a kingdom for 490 years, God finally says, all right, this is what's going to take place. The 7-year captivity, the land's going to have rest. Who's left? Who's left in the land? The poorest of the poor. There's not a whole lot they can do that are there. They're left behind to take care of the land. And God had said earlier by Jeremiah, it was going to be like desolation to the land. So for 70 years, there was not going to be all the industrial working of the land and going on like they normally did, and all that, the laughing and marriages and all those things that they always did was not going to take place. Because it's going to be a 70-year of captivity and 70 years of not using the land because of this. I'm surprised I got all the way through this. I really didn't think I was going to make it all the way through this. Any comments, any questions? This is the last slide here. Yes, brother.
Back in Jeremiah, page 29, it talks much about Jeremiah was warning folks that initially went into captivity to build homes and submit yourselves to the leadership. A lot of Jehoiachin's benefit when he was lifted up by the king of Babylon because he submitted himself, and he tried to tell these folks. And we can see after his reign, especially with Zedekiah, if they had just submitted themselves to the rulership that he told them was going to happen of Babylon, it would have been a lot easier for them. I find myself in this state now. We've got to sometimes submit ourselves to the laws and the rules of the. This is only temporary. This is not our home. We've got to know where we're coming.
That's right.
In the meantime, we conduct ourselves as Christians.
That's right.
Under the rule of land, as long as it doesn't compromise our faith and the doctrines of our faith and that stuff. They rebelled. God says you're going to have to deal with it. And build houses, plant vineyards, and just live. And for some of those folks, for 70 years captivity, they didn't see it when the king of Persia finally lifted up his hand and sent them back into it.
Right.
They would finish their lives in captivity. So
Yep.
just rebelling, amen, caused them a lot more issues than they probably would have had to suffer otherwise.
That's a good point, good summary of that to think about. God doesn't like rebellion. He doesn't like complaining. You see that we talked about in Israel with being in the wilderness. The people complained and griped. And God said, when God says this is going to happen, and we have said, no, it's not going to happen. We're rebelling. You think about it. And they rebelled against that. And as you pointed out, if they had done, Jeremiah warned them over time and time again. And when the Babylonians came in, Jeremiah was looked upon good by the Babylonians. And favorable. He wasn't carried away by them, but he was carried away by those who went to Egypt to go away. He was carried away by his fellow countrymen to go down to Egypt. But he wasn't carried away by the Babylonians because he told them that this judgment was going to come and that people would not listen and still rebelled against that. Any other comments, questions? Okay. Lord willing, we'll catch up on the next part of this lesson, of course, continuing their time in exile, what happens in the time of exile. And I forgot to mention, like you just said, brother, about them. Jeremiah emphasized to them, you're in the new land, you're going to be in this new land in Babylon, you need to make your houses, just live your life there. It's just part of what you're going to have to do for the 70 years is what you're going to have to do. And interesting, I'll go ahead and tell you now, Daniel is one of the few people who lived the whole entire time for the 70 years as a prophet.